Okay, so now our next speaker for the next hour is Dr. Julia Ambler. She's going to be speaking on ethics of research. Dr. Julia Ambler has been working in pediatric palliative care for the last 20 years, first in Oxford, UK, where she completed her diploma, and then in Durban since 2009. She co-founded Umduduzi Hospice Care for Children in 2013 and also works at Inkosi Albert Lutuli Central Hospital. She's a sessional lecturer in the departments of pediatrics and family medicine, Nelson Mandela Medical School, UKZN, and is the chairperson of the Association of Palliative Care Practitioners of South Africa. As a communication skills expert, she also is a workshop facilitator for the Medical Protection Society. Dr. Ambler, take over the stage.
Good morning, everyone. And I have to say, after I saw that your awards dinner was last night, I hope you all dressed up accordingly. And that registration was at 6:30 this morning. I thought, gosh, these nuclear medicine people are on a next level of commitment. So very well done to all of you. I wish I had been there to see some of the outfits. Yes, I can't imagine which is my favorite element on the periodic table to dress up as. Anyway. So I'm really here in my role with medical protection. We're obviously very invested in ethical practice in the country, and research is one of those areas that we are really very passionate about, and that's why I've been invited to speak to you this morning. I know it says an hour, and that feels like a very long time, so hopefully it doesn't actually feel like a very long time. So just to go through what we're going to cover this morning, we're going to look at sort of recent South African context. Then we're going to talk a little bit about research misconduct and what that looks like nowadays. Then a brief modern history of ethics and research, because it goes way, way back to sort of pre-biblical, pre-Torah times. Ethical principles in research, which we'll spend quite a bit of time on, then the key ethical norms and values, and then lastly, a little bit about discussing risk before we wrap up for the morning. So we have a beautiful guideline from the National Department of Health on ethics and research, which was published in 2015. And I just thought I'd set the scene with one of these opening phrases. South Africa is a democratic state in which human dignity, equality, and the advancement of human rights are respected, promoted, and protected in terms of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. Everyone has the right to bodily and psychological integrity, which includes the right, A, to make decisions concerning reproduction, B, to security in and control over their body, and C, not to be subjected to medical or scientific experiments without their informed consent. And I just love that as a way, a very strong, robust way of saying, this is South Africa, this is how we do things now. We know we didn't always do that in the past, but this is us now. And really looking forward to making sure that we are ethical in our research practices. We're a rich country in terms of variety, in terms of our healthcare system. It's largely excellent. There are pockets that are less excellent, but on the whole, we run a pretty good healthcare system for most patients to benefit from. We've also got research infrastructure. As we've heard today, we've seen over the last 4 days, the research that's come out, the papers, the posters. We've got it, we've got the skills, we've got the expertise. We also have a high burden of disease, both non-communicable and communicable diseases, which makes us very interesting. We've got lots of trauma, as I'm sure you're all aware, and then, of course, the poverty, which impacts a lot of of the health infrastructure, of the health dynamics in the country. So we're very attractive. Lots of people love to come here. They want to look at us from a socio-political point of view, a behavioral point of view, social development, education, and others. So there is a lot of research and attention paid on South Africa from outside, but also from within our own borders. In 1999, we had our National Research Foundation was established to support and promote research, and it's gone from strength to strength since then. And our National Health Research Ethics Council was established in 2006, and their most recent publication, as I said, was 2015, which is a beautiful document outlining everything that you need to think about when you're coming to do research to keep it ethical. In the last 20 years, we've seen an absolute explosion of the amount of publications from scientists in South Africa. And currently, in 2020, we were rated 31 in the world in terms of the numbers of papers that have been published. So per capita, per million, we're actually relatively low. We've got many more people than scientists publishing, but we're still 31 in the world, which is not too bad. Lots of good stuff coming out of South Africa. At the same time, we're also very, very involved in the Conference on Research Integrity. And most recently, their last conference was last year in May. It was held in Cape Town. And I'm very proud to say that the Cape Town statement is really profound and really well worth a read if you haven't had a look at it. But that conference was focusing on fostering research integrity in an unequal world. So really at the forefront of pushing research integrity across the world. As you heard from Prof this morning, there is a huge pressure to publish. Publish or perish is the phrase that people use. And this is because there is money involved in research. We are rewarded for our research. Our institutions are rewarded for our research by both the private sector and the Department of Higher Education and Training. So we know there's a big emphasis on our need to be publishing. So this can lead to problems, because if there's a pressure to publish, there's also a pressure to possibly cut corners and not do things as ethically as we could. So looking at research misconduct around the world, in high-income countries, there's quite a lot of research, and it shows that roughly between 2 to 14% of scientists may have fabricated or falsified data. There's less research in lower middle-income countries, such as our own, but the most recent paper I could find shows that 1/3 to 3/4 may be guilty of questionable research practices. That's a lot. That's a lot. Questionable research practices. Just think about that for a second. And the suggestion is that research misconduct is as common in both high and low middle income countries. So it's a uniform, it's not a uniquely developing country phenomenon. We know that around the world, scientists are tempted to cut corners. What kind of corners might they cut? So looking at what constitutes research misconduct, and there are very, very many forms of misconduct. Some of it is inadvertent, some of it is very planned. But it might be fabrication, where results are made up. It might be falsification, so a slight manipulation of the results to make sure that it kind of supports the hypothesis you were suggesting in the first place. There's downright plagiarism, and this is getting easier to detect with the programs that universities have got where we can check for plagiarism, but still people are tempted to copy another author's work without giving the due credit that it deserves. We also have to think about ChatGPT. I know that my sons are both in high school at the moment, and this is just a thorn in the teacher's neck. Now, how do you mark an essay if you don't know if AI wrote it or your son wrote it? So more and more they're making these poor children do the work in class, which means that they've only got the 30 or 40 minutes to do it instead of actually applying their minds. It's creating a new, unprecedented dynamic into the education system, and no different when it comes to research. So if you want to go and Google anything, ChatGPT will answer you as long as it's before September 21, unless you're going to pray for the more updated version. There's also misrepresentation, so someone suggesting that they've got qualifications that they don't actually have, not quite being true with the facts. Then there's a breach of duty of care, and I think this is a real problem around confidentiality and ensuring that even after the research is done, that the confidentiality and privacy of those participants is protected, whether that be inadvertently or purposefully shared with the wrong people. That is a big problem, that breach. And with our POPI Act nowadays in South Africa, which is very strict, and the consequences are enormous for clinicians if we are not doing it properly. So really being very careful there. Then the failure to meet ethical, legal, and professional obligations, and that pretty much covers all of the other kinds of research misconduct. And then lastly, improper dealing with allegations of misconduct. If it's reported and it's sort of brushed under the carpet, or the whistleblower is sort of fired and gently moved off to the side, that is a form of research misconduct, which is not acceptable but does actually happen. So let's go back in history. I see that we've had a lovely display of the Hertz history in the foyer area. So hopefully you're all a bit of a fan, but I think it does help to take us back to where research ethics kind of in its modern form began. Because as I said, there are lots of guidance that goes way back, long before 1947. But obviously there were atrocities committed during the Second World War, and there was no way to kind of judge those doctors that had performed these atrocities. So they had to come up with a code that's against which they could judge those doctors and say, well, your behavior was not good or it was good. And so they came up with these concepts of participation in research, what constitutes proper research, informed consent, and there's a lot more about informed consent that we can talk about, the benefit to society, protection from injury, and the qualification of the investigators. And that list became what was called the Nuremberg Code, against which those doctors that had committed those crimes against humanity during the Second World War could be judged and convicted. So that's kind of where it began. The World Medical Association in 1948 got together and made the Declaration of Geneva supporting the Nuremberg Code and saying that physicians must practice according to the law of humanity and to respect human life from conception, which is also another ethics talk on its own. Where does life begin? We're not going there today. The historical ethical misconduct, I had a look through the literature, and there is so much. It's really quite horrifying when you start looking at all the misconduct that has happened in the past. And I would say that our bit of plagiarism is not as serious as these things, but actually wrong is wrong and right is right. So bearing in mind that we need to keep within the law and keep within our ethics of research at all times. But just looking at some things that have happened in the nuclear medicine field. In 1953, the question was asked, does radioactive iodine affect premature babies differently from full-term babies? And both were given daily doses for a period of time. Hard to imagine. 1948 to 1954, Johns Hopkins University, very well-renowned university, produces a lot of scientific papers today. They inserted radium rods into the noses of 582 school children as an alternative to adenoidectomy, thinking it was a good thing. How many years? 1963, so it's getting later. We've already had a few guidelines coming out about ethical research. And the University of Washington researchers irradiated the testicles of 232 prisoners to determine the effects of radiation on testicular function. Unfortunately, these prisoners were never really followed up. What we do know is 4 of them had babies that were very abnormal and died. But that's the only 4 that we know about. The others were not followed up because, well, they were prisoners at the end of the day. And then the last example I'll give is 1960 to 1971, which again is recent history relatively. Dr. Sanger performed whole-body radiation experiments to more than 90 poor black advanced stage cancer patients with inoperable tumors at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. And they were told this was curative treatment. They were completely deceived and lied to by their physicians to see what would happen. So you can see that we really do need these guidelines to keep us in check, because without them, the practice was just a free-for-all. So in 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki, and we're now in our 7th iteration of that, but that really kind of started to focus on the well-being of human subject, taking precedence over interests of science or the interests of society. Ethics committees were encouraged to form and to monitor clinical research and the trials, and look at all the consent and the conflicts of interest involved. And this is where informed consent was first really encouraged to be written down. You have to get it in writing that the patient, the participant, understands what they're about to undergo. And the most recent iteration is in 2013. So the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences guidelines, they were written in 1993 and revised in 2002. And basically the purpose of these guidelines was, again, bringing together everything. Effective application, particularly in developing countries, were given their socioeconomic circumstances, laws and regulations, and executive and administrative arrangements. So these guidelines look at taking universal appreciated guidelines from across the world and helping developing countries implement them to make sure that wherever there are contrasting resources, we are still sticking to the guidelines, that ethical principles must be upheld and informed consent must be upheld. So there is a lot of guidance out there. In 1978, a landmark publication was brought out by the Americans, the Belmont Report, and this was in response to the Tuskegee syphilis study. So I'm sure it's quite a famous study for its all the wrong reasons. In 1932 to 1972, I think nearly 400 men from sort of impoverished Alabama were not treated for syphilis. They did not know they were not being treated for syphilis. And the idea of the study was to look at over how many years, what was the natural history of untreated syphilis. They were given stuff, they were told they were getting medication, but at no point did they understand they were not being treated for their medical condition. And that obviously just breached everything. And recently, in as late as 72. I like to say recent because I was born in 74, so very recent history. So from that, the American said, look, can't happen again. And so similar to the previous slide where I spoke about the council, they got together and wrote the Belmont Report. And this is really the first time that the Beauchamp-Childress kind of principles were brought in of respectful persons, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And this really forms the basis of a lot of what we talk about today for the protection of human subjects in research. And a lot of this developed this concept of informed consent. What does that mean? What does it look like? Risk-benefit assessment for the participants, and trying to sort of keep it in an ethical framework. So here we come to our beautiful document, 2015. The NDOH Research Ethics Committee have developed ethics in health research principles, processes, and structures. And if you're embarking on any research, it's well worth a read. It's a very well laid out document that gives you clear guidance as to what is ethical, what is not, and what you need to be thinking about as you proceed into your research. So let's just take a moment and think about, well, what is health research? What are we actually talking about here? And it's quite broad, really. The kinds of things we might be thinking about is anything contributing to the increase in knowledge around biological, clinical, psychological, or social welfare matters, and anything that involves human beings. The cause and effect and response to certain diseases. Effects of the environment on human beings. Methods to improve healthcare delivery, so the public health science. New pharmaceuticals, medicines, interventions, and devices, and I suspect you guys largely fall into that category, as well as new technologies that improve health and healthcare. So there's a very, very broad range of topics that are included in health research. So ethics in health research, our document, the South African document, says that all proposals must, prior to beginning, must undergo independent ethics review. And herein comes the importance of the university's ethics committees across the country. And they have become quite robust organizations where they are looking at every aspect of your research to determine whether or not it is in fact reasonable and ethical. Proposals must promote health, contribute to prevention of communicable diseases or non-communicable diseases or disability, or result in cures, or alleviate suffering. And that's where I fit in with my palliative care, is around the alleviation of suffering. So very, very broad covering. Proposals must stand up to scientific and ethical scrutiny appropriate to the disciplines concerned. And as you heard earlier, when you're asking for something to be published, once you've already done the research, not everybody knows your subject material. So you really have to get the right supervisor to make sure that you are on the right path from the time that you're writing your proposal, before you even begin your research. Proposals must ensure that harm to research participants is prevented, or at least minimized or balanced against any potential benefit to them. So if there's a minimal harm and a massive benefit, that may be acceptable in an ethical framework. Researchers must be accountable for all their activities, And we need to consider at all times our social and our ethical values. And they must be promoted. So let's look at our very old-fashioned, they come up all the time, but what does it mean in terms of research? So we know in clinical medicine how we might use these principles of Beauchamp and Childress, but how do we actually apply it to research? So for any research that we do, we need to maximize the benefit and minimize the harm. And that's quite hard to know with research because you sometimes don't really know. And I think when you look back to those 50s and 60s and 70s where they were doing these, what we know now are terrible things to human beings, they didn't know it then. But they did pick vulnerable populations, so maybe they had an inkling. But the idea is that we don't always know, but it's to be as careful as you can, weighing up what is going to harm, what might do good for our patients. We need to really, think about the benefits and make sure that anything we're suggesting aligns with those benefits, that any risk that we're taking is mitigated for, and that we can offer benefit to the patient. We need to think about our research design that has to be sound, absolutely 100%, hence the right supervisor for your research. The researchers must be competent to carry out the research. So doing something in a field that isn't yours is obviously a very bad idea and probably not that common. And then anything where humans are involved need to improve the human condition. So that must be the ultimate goal of beneficence, is to improve the human condition. But when we're adding to the research pool, that it's not just for our own good and for our own master's or our own PhD, but actually we are working towards a greater goal. The principle of justice. Well, this is about being fair. So quite tricky to get right. I know that I work at Albert Lutuli Hospital. I work a lot with cancer, children undergoing a variety of treatments, and they're a captive market. They really are, and we get approached all the time. I'm doing my master's on this, I'm doing my master's on that. I'd like to look at X in children with cancer. I want to speak to the parents of. And our head of department is quite hardcore, and the one was a palliative care researcher. I was dead keen that they come and do this research. And he said no, and I was like, he says, we have burdened this lot enough. Look at all the research that has been done on this particular group of children, on this particular group of parents. Isn't it hard enough that their kids got cancer? And I was put right back in my box, right back. But I think that is it. We're approached by so many people, so enthusiastic, everyone really enthusiastic about their particular topic, not realizing that that same population may well be overburdened already by other people that have separate but similar interests in that patient group. So justice is really about being fair, making sure that no population group is particularly burdened by our research or excluded in any way for the wrong reasons. Why would one, if somebody's going to benefit from our research, why should they be excluded? And it goes to, there are lots of exclusion criteria in research where we do need to look at it. The ethics committee must look and say, well, why did you exclude that group? Why are you not including those kids with X or those men with Y? Why have you made it only for Black South Africans? What about other population groups? Why are you even going to report on whether they the color of the patient or not? Is that actually relevant to the research topic at hand? Really kind of bringing us back to basics. We're so used to talking about things like race in South Africa that sometimes it's put in a research paper for no good reason. It doesn't change the result at all. So just kind of keeping in mind what we are researching, why we're researching, and is everything we're doing reasonable, and is it absolutely necessary? So no one must be burdened, no one must be unofficially excluded without good reason, is the principle of justice. Then there's respect for persons, dignity and autonomy, hugely important. And South African law leans toward patient autonomy in a very big way. We used to talk about what the reasonable doctor would do. Now we talk about what the reasonable patient would do. It's really been a big mind shift over the last sort of 20, 30 years. What would the reasonable patient do? So we need to think about the concept of capacity, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Those that have capacity to self-determination should be allowed to make their own decisions. and those decisions should be respected by us as researchers. Those with developing, impaired, or diminishing autonomy, so children, people with disabilities that affect their cognition, they need to be protected from harm. And that makes it very difficult, and certainly in our pediatric space, is that it's very hard to do research on children because of this, because they are already vulnerable. So kind of working with that, making sure that those populations are protected, but at the same time, it's not fair, it's not just to exclude children just because it's difficult to get ethics approval. We really need to analyze our motives about, do we just want to publish, or do we actually want to know what's going on with these children? And then dignity, well-being, and safety interests of all research participants must also be protected. And I love this because it's not something I've ever really thought about, that as a researcher, you need to be protected. Your work is your work. Your intellectual property, your authorship, those are things, and your safety during your research project should also be protected. So as much as we want to protect our patients and our participants, we also need to protect the researcher. And I really thought, for me, that was something I hadn't thought about before, how much the researcher needs to be kept safe from physical harm, but also from somebody stealing their work. So another concept I came across is this of prudence, and it's not in our South African document, and it's not in many of the research ethics documents, but it certainly is part of the International Commission on Radiological Protection, the ICRP. They produced a document. They hadn't before looked at ethics, and in 2018 they produced a really good paper, well worth a read, on ethical foundations of the system of radiological protection. And I love this concept that they included in their publication 138 of prudence. So prudence is the ability to make informed and carefully considered choices without full knowledge of the scope and consequences of actions. And I think that's really important, because a lot of our research, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We're not proving the provens all the time. Sometimes we are going into areas where there might be massive benefit, but in the short term, there could be some risk attached. So it's the ability that we can choose and act on what is in our power to do and not do. So it's not about being conservative or risk averse or completely risk intolerant. Okay, it's really more describing the process that we use. So where we are using our wisdom, our educated guessing, our abilities of deductive reasoning to make decisions. So prudence talks about the way we make decisions that are not solely the outcome of those decisions. And I think it's a really important point to include in our research, that actually it is okay to take risk, but it must be prudently done. It must be ethically based. It must be, educationally informed when we take those risks. So those are the ethical principles. Then when we take those ethical principles, how do we put them into norms and standards? Well, first we've got to look at relevance and value, then scientific integrity, role player engagement, and I'm going to go through each of these quite briefly. Fair selection, fair balance of risk and benefit, ongoing respect for participants, researcher competence and expertise, and lastly, informed consent. So let's look at relevance and value. It needs to be relevant. It needs to be valued. It needs to be South African. Okay, this is from the South African document. And really, I think a lot of our research can tend toward being about the researcher and not necessarily for the greater good. And our guideline, the standards and norms, says it should be for the greater good of the people of South Africa. Scientific integrity, as you've heard already, South Africa is very involved in promoting scientific integrity on an international basis, which is terribly exciting for us as researchers. So really, when it comes to your study design and methodology, we need to make sure that we've got it right. So again, having the right people around you, having the right advice from the right people who know, and that's regardless of whichever discipline you're in. We know that when you've got good methodology, and as Prof said, the people are going to read that methodology because they want to know if there is rigor and scientific integrity there. you're going to get much more reliable results than if your design is not great in the first place. So keeping to a good study design. The role player engagement. So understanding your audience, making sure that you have spoken to all the key people involved before you embark on the research. To improve the quality and the rigor of that research, it will also increase acceptability. If people are involved ahead of time in your research design, before you start actually implementing your research, they're much more likely to get on board and to assist you. If they understand the goals of your research, what are you going to achieve? How is this going to benefit them as a key role player in the research? We need to harness their expertise as well, and this is also participant expertise. Remember, participants know stuff about themselves. They know stuff about what their needs are. So looking at patient user groups, patient user networks, making sure that we're involving the right people in the setup and the need for that, that research to be done. And then offset power differentials where they exist, which we know there is a huge power dynamics all across medicine between doctor, patient, researcher, participant, child, parent. There are a lot of different dynamics involved in the healthcare system. When you're dealing with humans, there are always going to be power differentials. We need to look at a fair balance of risks and benefits. So looking at the risk-benefit analysis, and this is hard because, as I said earlier, we don't always know exactly what the risks and the benefits are going to be. But we need to think about the magnitude of those risks. How big are the risks? How serious might that risk be? And the likelihood of occurrence of that risk. So really sitting down and having a good thrash out before we expose any of our patients to radium rods in their noses. Fair selection of their participants. Again, this comes back to what we spoke about with the principle of justice already. We must be fair. It must be based on scientific principles, ethical principles, making sure that it is absolutely fair. And no one should be unfairly targeted or excluded. Ongoing respect. So we know that our participants have the right to privacy and to confidentiality. We need to make sure they are aware of that, and we need to know how we're going to ensure that going forward. So privacy really refers to who has access to the personal record. Confidentiality, appropriate measures will be implemented to prevent disclosure of information. And that is into the future, both now during the research and after the research is done. How are you going to ensure that that confidentiality remains, that their information is anonymized in an ongoing way, that they can't be identified at a later stage? Researcher competence and expertise, we've mentioned this already, that's part of the original principles. You need to know what you're doing. You need to be the right person for the job. And then lastly, informed consent. And I want to just spend a little bit of time looking at what informed consent is really. So as I said, in South African law, autonomy is king at the moment. There is huge respect for self-determination and the fact that people should be able to make their own decisions and those decisions be respected. But to have true autonomy, we need to have enough information, which I'll talk about shortly. We need to have capacity. So what does capacity refer to? Well, that is our ability to listen, to understand, to weigh up the benefits and the risks to ourselves, to assimilate those risks and benefits, to formulate a decision and then communicate that decision. Okay, so that excludes quite a lot of people from who are truly autonomous when they lack capacity. It doesn't mean they should be excluded from research, but the person consenting for them should have the authority, the legal right to do so, and they should have capacity to be able to admit them into research or not. So capacity is a really important concept to understand before embarking on any research. And then lastly, voluntariness. Participation is voluntary always. And then if you look at the research misconduct of the 50s, the 40s, 50s, 60s, none of that was voluntary really, not in any true sense of the word. And very often it's easy to manipulate people to say, oh, you should really do this. This would be an honor for you to do this. There's a lot of ways we can coerce patients or participants to be involved in research without meaning. Our intention is effectively benevolent, but it needs to be truly, truly voluntary and not coerced at all, no duress. And they need to know that they can withdraw at any time. And I think that is a researcher's bane of their existence, is that patients are going to withdraw from this. You know, I've been slogging on this for months or for years, and now this patient has decided they don't want to be involved anymore. But that is their right. And they need to know that from the beginning, and that needs to be part of the informed consent process. Looking at information and informed consent forms, very interesting, a recent paper in South Africa looked at papers from the last 5 years and found that 2/3 of the informed consent forms fail to meet South African readability standard. That's research from the last 5 years in South Africa. 2/3 of them. This means that there's different indices that are used to look at readability, and it should be, I think it's grade 8 level understandability. 2/3 of the forms failed. We need to think about how we're writing these forms. What language are we using? Who are we testing them out on? How many iterations of those forms? Really, where are these forms actually doing us a service or a disservice? Because they need to be easy to understand. So when we're presenting an informed consent form to a patient, they must be able to understand what's in it. The other things that need to be included in that form and in that conversation, because it's not a once-off form, it needs to be a conversation with a patient or a participant, that this is a research study. What we're doing here is research, and we are going to benefit from it. We're hoping you will, but we are also going to benefit from it. An explanation of the purpose of the research. Why do you want to do this particular thing? Description of all that is involved, any procedure that needs to take place, any conversation that's going to take place. So really unpicking what it means. The description of any risks, I love this, or discomforts. Okay, so it's not any risks. We think of risk as being quite extreme, but it could be discomforts. You know, maybe your throat will be sore for longer than it would be if I'd given you another treatment. That may be associated with participation. A description of the benefits that may be associated. A statement about confidentiality and privacy. They do need to understand that it is private, that it is confidential, and what are you as a researcher going to do to ensure that that continues both now and after the project is over. And then contact information for any further questions. Those are the key things that need to be involved. And obviously, according to your research, you might need to include other things, but this is the basics of what informed consent should be included. And just in the last few minutes, I want to look at how we talk about risk. So I don't want to be rude, but I think a lot of us struggle with statistics and struggle with numbers and struggle to understand what we are actually saying when we try and quantify risk for our patients. How do we communicate that risk? So firstly, we can use verbal descriptors. Common, not common, rare. What is rare? How often does it have to happen for it to be rare? And there has been research showing that patients, when they're told it's rare, overestimate the risk compared to what the doctor's actually meaning when he or she says rare. So verbal descriptors are not a useful way to talk about risk with our patients. What about percentages? 50% of people do not understand what 50% means. So throw out a percentage, you're not going to get a great level of understanding. So perhaps moving away from percentages. What about fractions, 1 in 20? That's quite reasonable. You might be able to explain that. But what happens when you use different denominators? So when patients are asked 15 out of 100, is that more or less than 2 out of 10? Think about it. More or less. It's less. But because the number 15 is so much bigger than the number 2, patients or many participants will think, and this is what the research has shown, that the numerator is what they look to. They look to, so, oh gosh, the risk is too high. No, I'm not doing that. That's 15 out of 100 versus 2 out of 10. 2 out of 10 is much more. But for the average participant, for the average human being, this is the way it's understood. Numerator is king. So use the same denominator if you're going to be using fractions to explain risks to patients. What about double? We all know about relative risk, and the press love this. You take this pill, you double your chance, and the drug reps also love this. You double this, you halve your risk. It's not relevant. A risk of 1 in 3,000 is small. A risk of 2 in 3,000, still small. Double. So really, when we're talking to our patients, we must make sure that we're using absolute risk values rather than relative risk values, because it's not useful to them. The press like it. The drug companies like it. Visual representations of expressing risk. This is very clear. You've got all those smiley faces, so the chances, is 2 out of however many that nothing will happen. One person out of that many is going to have something horrible happen. The others are all going to be fine. Really does help them to quantify in their own mind. Pie charts, great. Also another, as long as you're explaining it, another visual representation of what to expect. And there are textbooks written about this and how to explain this. And a lot of the examples come out of breast cancer screening and radiology. So well worth a look. What about framing risk? So it's easy to spin information to get patients to do what you want them to do, but we shouldn't. We need to make sure that we're doing both positive and negative framing. So this was an elegant study done by Gurman in 2000, and they looked at the way information was given. And when patients were told that complications are seen in 1 out of 100 people who undergo this procedure, only 27 people consented. When they were told that 99% of all patients undergoing this procedure have no complications at all, nearly double the number that consented to the procedure. And you've never seen a company advertising their hand wash with saying, after using our hand wash, 0.1% of all germs will be alive and kicking on your hands. And there's a reason for that. So the same when we are presenting the risks of our research to our patients, we need to understand where it's landing, how it's sounding, and doing both a positive and a negative frame when you're providing patients or participants with information is absolutely crucial, because otherwise you're spinning the information the way you want to. So a bit of self-reflection there is a good idea. The politicians could do with this slide. So just to summarize, in terms of communicating risk, we need to normalize risk. Everything has a risk, including doing nothing. So there's always risk. Even when we offer no treatment, no intervention, no research, there's always a risk. Simple numbers and visual aids really do make a difference. Using the same denominator, remember numerator is king. Absolute risk rather than relative risk. Positive and negative framing. And then the last point on that slide is checking in with the emotions. Very often when you say to somebody there's a high risk of, automatically the benefits diminish in the mind. It becomes quite an emotional thing. Well, if the risk is very high, that means the benefit is low. And yet we know that sometimes the highest risks, interventions or procedures have very high benefit as well. So checking in with your patient or your participant, how are you feeling? Before I sign you up, what are the emotions going on here? And that's not something we would normally associate with scientific research, is patient emotion or participant emotion. But it absolutely has impact. If you want to sign people up correctly, we need to be checking in with them emotionally. Where is this landing? All this talk about risk and benefit, where is it landing? How is it sounding to you? Can I explain a bit more? If there's been a risk that's been overestimated in the patient or the participant's mind, what do I need to do to check in with that? And one of the guidelines, I love the statement, empathy has not been widely accepted as an ethical value, yet it plays an essential role in situations where perceived and factual risks are often diverging. So making sure that when you are explaining risk in your consent process to your participant, that you're checking in emotionally, because you don't want people saying no or yes for the wrong reason. So in conclusion, humans are complex. We know this. Ethics in research is also complicated. And it can be if you start, you can go down on a deep dive looking at covert research and deception research, and that means no informed consent. There's a lot out there to read and to understand. But look at what happened without these principles, without these guidelines. We've harmed people over the years, inadvertently and overtly. We've planned it in some situations, and we've chosen vulnerable populations. Even with the guidelines, there is still research misconduct that goes on. So my encouragement to you is that ethics committees are absolutely essential. They are playing a brilliant role in keeping us on the straight and narrow. We need to take pride in being a scientist. We need to keep on keeping on. because there is a wealth of knowledge sitting in this room. There are papers that need the world to see, that we need to get our information out there because we are doing such good work. And we need to make sure that work is with integrity at all times as a South African. And just a final reminder that participants are people in what we're talking about today, and people need our empathy. We need to be able to support them during the research and get the best out of them to make sure that our research is both finished with integrity, but also is held to the highest ethical principles. And there are my references, and I'm done.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ambler, for such an amazing talk.